Hello, you are listening to another video for week 7 regarding your papers on assumptions and the readings that I want you to think about this week. Of course, you've turned in a rough draft or a provisional draft of your assumptions inferences paper, and I'll be taking a look at those and responding to them right away. However, you should not stop thinking about this paper and the topics that you've chosen to write on. I want them to be high quality, and I want the writing to be high quality. That means not just that you're attending to grammar, which is important, but also that you're thinking about that thesis and the kind of analysis that's required for this assignment. We're well along in the semester now. You should be showing me that you can really dig into the topic. And so if you're having questions this week, this is the time to check with me, and I will attend to everybody's questions in turn. I put this slide back not that you haven't seen it in a previous video, but just to remind folks that we're looking at the etymologies of words because, of course, it's a language class, but because also it's part of the concepts of each term that we're taking, using them to distinguish between the other terms and to make sense of what we're taking a look at in our writing and also, of course, in the topics that we've chosen. Assumption, of course, being this last one, meaning to take up. You take it up, you don't put it down. Usually you don't put it down until you take something else up. Assumptions occur at least in pairs and oftentimes in multiples. And they can help guide all the inferences that we make. So really there's no lack of scrutiny that we can give them for an assignment such as this. And we really want clarity, as it says here in the bottom of the slide. I get to show this slide, which has a nice Dilbert cartoon. And of course you've seen the quotes before and probably heard the second one before. But the idea is as relevant as anything we've seen so far, that we're prepared to see something because of our previous experiences, because of what we have come to expect. And the point here is that those expectations are built on a host of different assumptions and experiences that we've had throughout our lives that allow us to see and interpret what we're having happen to us and develop our inferences. And that's why we have a care with them. That's why we're trying to make them visible through our writing in this assignment. In the assignment itself, you're asked to look at a problem and understand its complexity. Of course, I have to ask you, what are you prepared to see? And I remind us of the old man and the 12 Angry Men. I kind of like him even more than Henry Fonda because he's the fellow who's very perceptive, even though he's old and oftentimes ignored on the jury. What has an old man got to offer? What has he got to say about things someone says to him? And of course, he is the old man offering something and saying something, though usually neglected. Yet he's so perceptive, and not just because he has 20/20 vision, as he emphasizes in part of the movie, but because he is open-minded and he's going to take into consideration the things that need to be considered. He's come to the jury with expectations, but he's not unwilling to examine them. Now, I give you 2 readings this week. One is on Virginia Woolf, and it's an older reading. I kind of like using it in conjunction with the other, which is on Tim O'Brien, whom you've looked at in other readings before. But Virginia Woolf has a 3-picture story that's really relevant for us, I think. She begins the whole essay, the whole story really, by saying it's impossible that one should not see pictures. She goes on to talk about if someone were a peer of the realm, and by that you might mean a state senator or someone who's really important, driving by and taking a look at a blacksmith who is on the lower echelons, not unimportant, but certainly not kingly at that moment. And we both have pictures of each other and what we come to expect of each other. It's true for almost any situation or class or person in life. Teachers have expectations. Sometimes they're pictures of students. Students have pictures of teachers. They say actually that students in a classroom give their teachers about 40 seconds for that first class before they make a decision on whether that teacher is going to be relevant to them, sometimes less. It's impossible that we shouldn't see in pictures, and so too for the sailor's homecoming. I'm just going to lay this out because these are the 3 different pictures that we get in the sailor's homecoming, and I hope you've read it. So if you haven't, pause the video and go take a look at it, because I want you to look. First section actually talks about the sailor coming home, and Virginia Woolf emphasizes how this is quite a picture. Now in her day, Virginia Woolf was watching not only sailors, but also Army veterans come home, other people come home from wars, different wars. And she'd watch their homecoming, and sometimes the sailors were not watched actually after they got out of the theater of war, and she was kind of famous for actually drawing attention to that. In fact, one of her famous characters, Septimus Warren Smith, is someone who returns from war, a veteran, and has to deal with the aftermath of returning from war, for which each veteran has different reactions, of course. There's no one reaction. But this sailor comes home, everything looks just great, and then we discover down at the bottom a loud cry rang through the village. That's what we're told. But it's not really part of the picture. All we get is that loud cry disturbing the night, until we discover, of course, the next day that a man is digging a grave, and the children are picnicking right by that grave. What a picture, we're told. And, of course, hidden in that picture are some things that are not in the picture. And that's one thing that's wonderful about Woolf, is she helps point out the things that are left out of the picture and draw our attention to that by sort of not drawing our attention to it, or noticing how people aren't drawing attention to it. In this case, Woolf is pointing to it through language, and pointing to what's outside the picture and outside of our assumptions, which is why I like it, because it's really out of sight, out of mind in a way. It's like the things that are buried underneath. While the people are picnicking. They're on the surface of experience and not noticing what might otherwise be a picture of a tragedy, or a picture of something that's gone unnoticed that should be noticed. For Woolf, this means that pictures really frame what we see. And with any kind of frame, some things are assumed to have importance, other things recede into the background or are left out of the frame, if we want to continue that metaphor. If you don't like a frame metaphor, think of a lens. It's brought into our perspective. We bring it into our perspective, and those things that are outside the lens we don't notice. That's Virginia Woolf for you, and such a prescient insight, I think, lends itself to taking a look at O'Brien, not just because he writes about folks in the theater of war, but also because what he's having to write about is a matter of assumptions and perceptions, because if we go back here for a second, we're still dealing with assumptions. Assumptions guide the kind of pictures that we see in. If you take that metaphor, it's just another way to talk about it. If we're not focused on what happens to that veteran the next day, or after the veterans come home, then we're missing and assuming some things that haven't taken place. So too with O'Brien. When I teach the first chapter, The Things They Carried, and that's all you really have to read, because you've actually read 2 other chapters during the course of class, and I'm only required you to read a little bit. The Things They Carried is very worth reading. Many of my students have come having read that before, and that's okay. I get to take a look at something else in it that sometimes they haven't taken a look at. I would say that 90% of my students look at Lieutenant Cross and his experience after Ted Lavender dies, and they side with him. They think he's totally right, which is kind of funny, because they thought he was wrong before that, or if they thought at all, they thought that he was someone who should be judged for the experience and the death of Ted Lavender. What's interesting is so many students tend to pile on to Lieutenant Cross's judgment. You might remember that in that story, which I hope you've read, he says he was now determined to perform his duties firmly and without negligence. It wouldn't help Lavender, he knew that, but from this point he would comport himself as an officer, he would not tolerate laxity, he would show strength, distancing himself from his men. He's going to be the picture of the good soldier, if you will, in that sense. That's the new assumption that he thinks he's going to adopt, though anyone who's read further in the book knows that there's a continuation of this topic in further chapters. There's Lieutenant Cross, though, in this particular chapter, judging himself. Notice it's not what the characters in the story judge him for. In fact, Kiowa, as it says here on the right-hand side, shook his head sadly and glanced over at the hole where Lieutenant Jimmy Cross sat watching the night. One thing was for sure, he said, the lieutenant's in some deep hurt, Kiowa says. That crying jag, the way he was carrying on, it wasn't fake or anything. He was really heavy-duty hurt. The man cares, sure, Norman Bowker says. Say what you want, the man does care. They come to think they know the lieutenant better and actually are closer to him in understanding that he loves his men, or takes care of them anyway, or wants to take care of them, whereas he's concluded the reverse, the opposite, and that he's going to distance himself from his men to be a better lieutenant. The beautiful thing about O'Brien's writing is it doesn't let you sit still with one set of assumptions. It'll profile different people within the same group coming to almost completely different assumptions about an experience. And that's pleasurable in one sense because, well, Lieutenant Cross doesn't get to decide which one's the more important assumption. Or if we like, we can take a look at Mitchell Sanders, who, as we can tell from the end of the story, amputates a thumb from one of his victims and calls it a moral. He's talking about Lieutenant Cross and Ted Lavender's experience of having died, really. And he says there's a moral there. And this is the same moment that he's taking this segment of a hand as if he's parting it from the body and drawing a souvenir for himself. In the same way, he's kind of drawing a lesson or a moral, if you will, from the death of Ted Lavender. There it is, man. But he doesn't really elaborate on it. It's as if it's his own thing, and you can't really explain it or specify it. In that sense, he's literally dissected something from the whole story and kept it as a souvenir, whatever it might mean. That's Mitchell Sandals for you. And really, we get a variety of different responses to Ted Lavender's death. Here they are again. Lieutenant Cross, self-blame. Kiowa, the lieutenant cares. Mitchell Sanders and his thumb of a moral that he cuts from the body of the whole work, separating it. I go back to our book, and if you haven't already, take a look at it again for what it has to say about assumptions, because it says it quite well. At one point on page 145, it says, what would someone have to believe in order to come to this conclusion? We could apply that to any of the characters here, O'Brien, with Wolf, with your own papers, I hope, because that's what you're really trying to study. You're trying to understand why people arrive at the conclusions that they do. What would someone have to believe, or what series of things would they have to believe in order to reach this conclusion? Or, to put it in my words, what previous experiences could have prepared this person to see the world through this picture? Why is it that they have come with these set of expectations, with this preparation, to see the world as they have? Don't just immediately judge it as wrong. Try to understand where it came from. That will be the analysis of assumptions. It's okay to show the weaknesses of those assumptions if you want to, especially if you're talking about a revision that you made to your own assumptions. But first, we understand how they're created to avoid the same potential errors and try to get a better set of assumptions, right? That's what we do through our lives. All right, there we are. I leave you with, of course, the picture of the old man, just like me, person who's usually not noticed, not heard, and yet provides so much and comes at the jury with so much to offer. I hope that people take that analysis that he gives seriously and think about that wise contemplation, putting up with it. As he says to Henry Fonda, I'm not sure what I think about the decision about this fellow, but I'm willing to listen and to be open-minded. And that's what he does.